If you know anything about the novel Strangulation Romanticist by Nisio Isin, it's that it was supposedly written in just 3 days. On the surface, this may sound like an exaggerated rumor, and yet it seems to be true. The Zaregoto Dictional is a book Nisio wrote as a sort of bonus novel to the mainline Zaregoto series, containing extra info about the series' world as well as details on its creation. And about Volume 2's creation, he writes the following. In contrast to Kubishime Cycle, a novel that required many rewrites, research and interviews, and a great deal of time and effort from start to finish, Kubishime Romanticist was, to be honest, a novel that I wrote almost entirely by hand. I finished it in 2 or 3 days. Oh, great. Not only did Nisio himself confirm it, but it's also possible he finished it in 2 days instead of 3. Some have posited that Nisio Isin may have planned out the novel before these 3 days, which would make the task far more feasible. But in an interview, all sources linked down below by the way, Nisio said that he generally doesn't plan out his novels beforehand, not to mention that Nisio himself admits that Volume 2's creation was much more spur of the moment than its predecessors. So unless there's something out there contradicting this that I don't know about, the most likely theory is that Nisio genuinely did write this novel without any set-in-stone plan, except for some broad strokes of the story he had in his head. Maybe it's true that he had more of an idea of what he wanted the story to be than most of his other books, but I doubt it was as concrete as many may imagine. Others have posited that Nisio only finished the first draft of V2 in 3 days, and that any rewrites took far more time. This line of thinking is probably correct. There's no way that the version of the novel we got is the one Nisio wrote in 3 days. I mean, surely the original version would have grammatical errors and messy prose, right? Writers have editors, and Nisio most likely has one as well. So, in those 3 days, Nisio wrote the first draft of Strangulation. But I also get the sneaking suspicion that the novel was pretty much finished in Nisio's eyes after the first draft. As in, it's right there in the quote that he finished it in 2 or 3 days. In that same quote, Nisio compares V1's development to V2's, saying that V1 took extensive rewrites, before heavily implying that V2 did not. Speaking of quotes, Nisio is also responsible for this one. Approximately how much time do you spend polishing your manuscripts? 1 day. The term polish here is a bit non-specific, but nonetheless, the general sentiment is clear. It seems like Nisio is a bit of a free spirit when it comes to touching up his manuscripts. So, taking this all into account, here's what I think happened. Nisio really did finish the first draft in 3 days, before sending said draft to his editor. While I'm not overly versed in the relationships between novel authors and their editors beyond some cursory research and watching emo say, if I had to guess, I'd say it differs from novelist to novelist and project to project. And at the very least for this project, I imagine his editors saw nothing that needed to be significantly reworked, and instead just touched things up and corrected a few errors. I doubt Nisio did all that much work on the novel himself at this stage, and considered the book largely finished, because if he did do a significant amount of retooling and rewriting at this stage, Nisio's claim of finishing the novel in 3 days would become more than a little misleading. Finished it in 3 days seems like a weird way to say 3 days plus weeks of rewriting, especially considering it's being contrasted against V1, which is a novel where he specifies that he did a lot of rewriting. Of course, this is all speculation based on a single quote, and I can't really prove any of this, but this is what I've gleaned from the information at my disposal. I don't think I need to tell you how impressive an achievement this is, but where Nisio's feat gets even more astounding is that he didn't just write a novel in 3 days. He wrote what is universally considered one of the best entries in the Zaregoto series in 3 days. This was no slapdash half effort. This was what many would consider a masterpiece. That's probably where most people's appreciation for this feat begins and ends. But for me, that doesn't quite cover it. There's something about the idea of writing a novel in 3 days that's so incomprehensible, so unlike me, that I have a different sort of enamorment with this factoid than most people. But is this novel actually as good as everyone says it is, or did the limited time frame it was created in stifle its potential? That's what we're here to find out today. Welcome to part 2 of my Zaregoto series, as well as the Zaregoto series. And boy, does it feel good to be back. And to those of you who haven't seen the first part of this video series, hey, no worries. It shouldn't be too hard to follow regardless. And with all that being said,
days in a watery cave, another song for the day that I take to the grave. I gotta be the first to see the specter. Everybody wants to be friends with the nectar protector. 17 skulls in a hole in the woods. Already know of the low, that I know of the goods. Can't see but lo and behold her. It's funny how we think with the hips, when the shoulder is colder. This is the truth about it. You'll learn to never doubt it. The whole affair is shrouded in living mystery. So what goes on in your tree when all you know is your evil shadow has a cup of tea? Back in elementary school, there was a kid we knew. We considered him cool, and when his eyes turned red, the principal said he was gonna go mad from the things in his head. 17 days later, somebody told us there was no more school, and the principal sold us to the ice cream shop down the street, where it seemed there was nothing they'd let us eat, so we screamed. This is the truth about it. You'll learn to never doubt it. The whole affair is shrouded in living mystery. So what goes on in your tree when all you know is your evil shadow has a cup of tea? It's never too late to take the chance of a lifetime under the waist.
although I will describe certain plot points and character attributes in depth, this video will not contain any major spoilers. Until I say so. I'll be a bit more loose with V1 spoilers, but up until chapter 5 they shouldn't be too bad. One thing that people often cite when claiming that V2 is superior to V1 is the strides it takes in further fleshing out and developing E's character. And I will say, as someone who loved E in the first volume, the purported copious amounts of characterization he got in this one made me desperate to read it. Volume 1 characterized E as apathetic, overly willing to go with the flow, an average Joe among geniuses, self-aware, and self-hating. It then tested the limits of his apathy by having him accept death because of it, before in the nick of time choosing life for kunagisa's sake. Volume 2 almost entirely ditches the genius aspect of the story, considering we're no longer at Wet Crow's Feather Island. For similar reasons, we don't get the intrigue of E's faults getting slowly revealed by Maki Himena. Instead, we get more insight into just how broken a person E is. He's as apathetic as ever, even down to the small details. For example, his apartment is pretty much empty, so he passes the time by playing 8 queens in his head. He doesn't dislike boredom and can hardly feel pleasure. Thus, he does very little for recreation. But it gets crazier than that. E can willingly inflict pain on himself without even grimacing to an extent that most would find physically and mentally impossible, because although E still finds physical pain excruciating, his mental resistance to it is near nothing. People die in this novel, which isn't a spoiler. It's literally called Strangulation. I mean, come on. Would you care to guess the way in which they die? But anyway, I'll get into this more in the spoiler section, but let's just say the tragedy of E is omnipresent in the main character deaths as well. We also learn more about how E thinks about the world at large and about his past. E regards himself as a failed product. In life, what counts as a fatal wound? I mean, an impact on your life so intense, so devastating, that you fall into a state where you're human but inhuman. You're a person but can't live. Alive but are dead. In other words, failing. The key here is that even after failing, it goes on. You simply suffer in agony, and it goes on. Forever. Endlessly. Even after your potential to be you has long been cut off, it goes on. When E was younger, he was a full-of-himself loner. He thought about the world harder than everyone else around him, and had fun solving the questions he confronted himself with. He stayed within his own mind, feeling as if the world revolved around him. He thought theory could supplant experience and that he could be happy by his lonesome. But he was wrong. He was just a stuck-up teenage idiot. And that realization not only crushed his self-esteem to bits and pieces, but left him apathetic to the idea of figuring out the world as a whole. Theory can't supplant experience, and thinking has only left me like this, so why think about anything to begin with? E is, at his core, someone with a tendency to think really hard about the world, and is intelligent, however much he thinks he isn't. But he has flaws, and his perspective is limited, so why not leave all that problem solving to geniuses like Aikawa and Tomo? Why even persist if he's failed? There are times when I don't relate to E at all in this volume, but what E's describing right now is about as literally me as it gets. For a long time, I've harbored a lot of animosity towards my younger self. When I was 15, I thought I had the world figured out, as teenagers do. I rarely toyed with the idea that I was fallible, and had complete confidence in everything I said and did. And while there's nothing wrong with being confident, I didn't acknowledge my potential to be wrong, and I didn't acknowledge the work required to find the truth in the first place. So when I inevitably found out just how flawed I was, my ego came a-tumbling down. I was also just an insufferable edgelord, and many of my older videos have moments that truly make me want to pull my hair out with frustration towards my younger self, but I think I've demonstrated this point enough. I hate that version of myself, and my inability to be at peace with my flaws of years ago has only harmed my self-esteem. In E's case, it's why he hates himself so much, and at least a part of why he's so apathetic. To him, he's failed as a person, and there's no coming back from it. But there's multiple flaws in E's way of viewing things. Not only can you come back from failure, even if said failure is being a human failure, but also what happens to E isn't really all that different from what most people go through. High schoolers are almost always like this. It's like what they're known for. They think they're super-de-duper special and that they have everything figured out, which is where you get comments like, "I'm 13, but feel like I'm 30. I'm aware I'm saying all this like I'm not just 19, but what I'm getting at is, there's a good chance you relate to this aspect of E's character too. E's teenage delusion might have been worse than most people's, but being a stupid teenager doesn't mean you're a defective product. It doesn't mean your potential is long cut off. And yet, E continues believing such. That's the tragedy of E for ya. Another aspect of E's character I relate to is his self-reported crummy memory. Now, I say self-reported because it's up in the air as to whether E's memory is actually terrible or if he just doesn't care about anything, which causes him to not put effort into remembering it. But I kinda hope E's memory is actually just that crummy, because my memory is abhorrent. Like, I'm talking abyss tier. There are only 2 people I know who have worse memory than I do, and it gets even worse when I co-host a podcast with someone who has the best memory out of anyone I've met. Like, bruh, how do you remember the names of every side character in the show we watched? I still forget the main character's name half the time. There's a reason why I have Volume 2 right next to me as I'm writing this, 'cause I do not trust my memory of events enough to rely on it. TLDR, I relate to E's struggle with his memory. However, like I said earlier, there are some parts of E's character that I definitely don't relate to. Like, say, being prone to violence and fearing you have the capacity to kill someone. A trait best exemplified by "That's finally me and you and me, just us and your friend Steve." Of all the new characters this novel adds to the mix, Hitoshiki Zerozaki is by far the most interesting to me and seemingly just about everyone else who's read this novel. Even down to the way he's introduced, he commands your intrigue. Early on in the story, we're told about a serial killer named the Prowler, who hasn't been caught by the police yet. Now, from the reader's perspective, we already know that this is Hitoshiki. How, you might ask? E literally tells us who it is in the prologue. But although we know the killer's name and a small amount of his personality, the fact that we've been hyped up about this hitoshiki guy since the very first page, that this character is so important that the entirety of Kyoto is on the lookout for this guy, that he's a potentially dangerous presence what with his murder biz, it's all elaborate stage setting to make sure that we're as excited as possible to meet this guy. So one day, after some good ol' McDonald's, E takes a stroll downtown when he suddenly feels a murderous presence watching him. I walked, the presence followed me. I walked some more, the presence followed me. The tension build leading up to E and Hitoshiki's confrontation is phenomenal, as he walks around town knowing that the presence following him is looking for the first opportunity to kill him. Until finally, E leads him under Shijo Bridge, an isolated area, and they face off. He was unlike me in almost every conceivable way. Our similarities began and ended with age and gender, and yet I felt like I was looking into a mirror. That's why I was confused, and my counterparty appeared just as confused. E and Hitoshiki's meeting almost has this sense of destiny to it, or perhaps anti-destiny. Something like the first episode of Zetsubo-sensei, when it's said that Kafka and Nozomu are two people who were never supposed to meet. They both immediately, wordlessly recognize that the person they're facing is just like them. Hitoshiki proceeds to immediately refer to E as his doppelganger. The rest of the book explores what exactly it means for Hitoshiki to be E's reflection. I adore this scene. The sense of destiny really makes it stick out in your mind and keep a spot in there rent-free like the Twitter users always say. And what's even better is that the book kinda cucks you for a while by not actually showing the vast majority of E and Hitoshiki's first conversation under the Shijo Bridge. It waits a hefty while, only giving you brief teases of what their dynamic is like before the two finally meet up again and we can learn about this mysterious Hitoshiki character, and what about him makes him E's mirror image. It keeps you wanting more, and the only way to get more is to keep reading. Like E, Hitoshiki is self-loathing. He's relatively unsociable, and in case you couldn't tell from the fact that he's a goddamn serial killer, not exactly bursting with sentimentality and empathy. They even have similar catchphrases. Instead of calling situations nonsense, Hitoshiki says, "What a riot." Translation time! There is another way that Hitoshiki's catchphrase is commonly translated. What a masterpiece. On the surface, masterpiece and riot mean entirely different things, which has caused this translation discrepancy to befuddle audiences far and wide for decades. But while scripting, I figured out why this discrepancy exists. In Japanese, the phrase, "what a masterpiece," is implied to be sarcastic. The phrase is calling something a masterpiece in jest. This implication isn't immediately understood in English, so Vertical localized it to "what a riot" in order to communicate its original intended meaning. For the remainder of this series, whenever referring to the catchphrase, I will simply use the version present in whatever translation I read the volume from. But what I find really cool is that during the two's interactions, they both seem subtly like they're on the same page. Like, obviously, because they're two separate people, even taking destiny into account, they can't read each other's minds or anything like that, so they aren't literally thinking the same thing. But because they're so alike, they can talk for hours sharing mutual interest in the same subjects, including, as E divulges on page 107, philosophy and views on life. I find that particular detail interesting, because that's not something everyone talks about with each other or even finds interesting to begin with. Speaking for myself here, I philosophize to me, not my friends. But E's clearly someone who has, in the past, and to a much lesser extent now, thought very hard about the world, and who admits that he probably won't ever find out the truth of it all. And I get the sense that Hitoshiki and E are similar in this regard too. In essence, they're both pseudo-intellectuals, just like Nisio and just like me for real. Another interesting thing is that despite finding each other so easy to talk to, neither wants to become friends with the other. Most of their conversations are capped with, "We'll probably never see each other again." This is, from what I can tell, for two reasons. One, neither is particularly fond of other people, and two, because both are self-loathing, neither would be particularly fond of their mirror image. Tell me, Zerozaki, what? Is there someone you love? Hell no, man. Incidentally, I hate myself the most. Or maybe you. Why do you ask? However, the most interesting thing about I's mirror is not how it reflects what we already know about I, but what new it tells us about him. A running theme with I and Hitoshiki is that each could have turned out like the other, and both are glad they aren't, which means that I has the capacity for murder. He even admits it verbally to Mikoko during one of the best scenes in the book, which, oh my god, we'll get to, where he talks about harboring a monster inside him and a thirst for violence that he has to keep down. On the one hand, ow, the edge, and on the other hand, I should probably refrain from saying "just like me for real" when talking about I from now on. Meanwhile, Hitoshiki's explanation for being a serial killer is that he's on the serial killer track. So, all of us are on a track, so to speak, a general direction in life that we're aiming for. For someone like me, my track is to work in a creative industry with as much self-expression as possible. And to my knowledge, I got on that track when I was 9 years old watching Minecraft Let's Plays all day and thinking, man, it would be so cool to make these for a living. When I was 14, I started writing, and since then, on and off, the bulk of my energy and motivation has been allocated towards creative pursuits. In that same way, Hitoshiki is on the murder track. He isn't a lust murderer, nor someone who murders for the thrill of the crime. It's just that when he was a kid, before he even realized it, he was thinking up ways to murder people like it was the natural thing to do. He doesn't know who set out these rails for him, or why he's on that track. All he knows is that he's too far along to quit, and that he simply needs to ride these rails out. To Hitoshiki, murder is quite literally just a matter of course. It's a delightfully abstract and bizarre motivation for murder that fits Nisio's pedigree, and honestly, something so creative, I couldn't have even come up with it myself. It just makes me love Hitoshiki even more. I feel like much of the past two sections have been me just recapping I and Hitoshiki's attributes, but there's no other way I can really think of to convey just how much depth they have. Nisio has this knack for writing characters who could honestly be analyzed until the sun sets. When I inevitably reread this novel in full, I'm sure I'll have found even more to like about them. It's through crafting characters who have so much to them and who feel truly distinct from any other character I've seen that the casts in Nisio's stories stick with me more than any other writer I know about. One final thing about Hitoshiki. I love his character design to bits. The face tattoo, the red sunglasses, his cocky expression, and oh my lord, the camo hair. This is on par with Jun Aikawa as one of my top 2 favorite designs in the series. And mind you, most of the other designs have already been stellar. God, I love Take. Many people speed read books. Some people speed read Japanese light novels. However, some decide to take things to the next level. Speedrunners. On October 22nd, 2020, runner Kakuzo Akutagawa set the Kimchee % Zaregoto Volume 2 speedrun world record at 26 seconds. It was a beautiful run, using multiple strategies, including exploiting a game-breaking glitch called a Spanish accent. However, on June 19th, 2023, a new runner named Crunchybagels would enter the scene, and set a new record in this run. I made my way to the Donbury corner and placed an order. Excuse me, a large kimchi bowl, please, no rice. The lunch lady gave me a quizzical expression and said, "That's just kimchi, son," but she dished it out all the same as if it were nothing. She plopped it in front of me with an admirable surfeit of professionalism, a heaping mountainous bowl of kimchi. I doubt there was a single tongue in this world tough enough to chow all that down and still preserve a sense of taste and out of satisfaction. Placed the bowl on my tray and settled the bill. Today, this is where the record stands, although a certain Italian has dedicated himself to beating my record. Luckily, his perpetually slurred femboy voice has stopped him from achieving a valid run.
Featuring long and convoluted similes.
Tomo kunagisa is nearly entirely absent from this novel. I know, I was sad when I realized it too. And I won't pretend like her presence wasn't missed. In place of Tomo as I's female companion for the novel, we have Mikoko aoii. To be honest, most of what makes Mikoko interesting will be in the spoiler section of this video, but for now, let's talk about her dynamic with I. I like it. Mikoko has a similarly bubbly personality to Tomo, and is equally as in love with him, which consistently goes over I's head for most of the novel. But although Mikoko cares a lot about I, the inverse is far from true. I likes her zero and hates her zero, much unlike his dynamic with Tomo, who I has the most fun next to out of any other person. But perhaps my favorite non-spoiler aspect of their dynamic is how I is kind of a bully to her. See, Mikoko is the kind of innocent girl who won't fight back against that kind of stuff beyond a quick burst of anger, so I can get away with things like pranking her on the phone, or making her hit herself when she shows up to his house late, or trying to get out of going to Mikoko's friend's birthday party in increasingly obvious and rude ways. There's even a part where I remarks to himself that Mikoko has a habit of hitting objects near her when she's angry, so when he pisses her off, he needs to stay out of that range, before cutting himself off, wondering why he's actively trying to piss her off in the first place. I may be apathetic, but he has more than one facet to him, and isn't a completely tepid conversationalist. The side characters of this novel consist of Mikoko's friends, muimi atemiya, tomoe emoto, and usami akiharu. There's also Miiko Asano, I's neighbor. I could go into their personalities one by one, but we'd be here all day, and really, I'm not too interested in doing so. I'm not nearly as endeared to them as the main cast anyway, considering their relative lack of page time. Except for Miiko, but we'll get to that. Well, I say they're not that endearing, but let me emphasize that this is all comparative to the other characters. If we compare the side characters in this novel to, let's say, any of the characters in a bog-standard isekai, all of a sudden, Tomoe Emoto would seem like the most fascinating character ever put to page. And the reason for this, in large part, stems from the more I think about it, the more I realize just how intertwined dialogue and characterization are. What the characters say is the primary method through which their personality, outlook on life, and all that other biz is conveyed to the audience. So, for example, if a character were to go on a philosophical tangent about their beliefs on the world, that would inform us not only of their beliefs, but that they are the type of person who would go on a philosophical tangent in that situation. Inversely, if a character is talking about nothing interesting whatsoever, we're learning either nothing about them, or if we want to take a more cynical approach to it, we're learning that this character is the type who says things that bore us half to death and that we'd never want to interact with in real life. But even more than that, characters who say interesting or fun things are inherently more endearing to the audience because we like people who say things that capture us, unless you somehow don't like interesting and fun things, but hey, that's between you and your therapist. And as it just so happens, interesting and fun pretty much describes all of Nisio's dialogue. In my last Zaregoto video, I compared its dialogue scenes with monogataris, mostly in terms of the amount of dialogue each of the novels contained, as well as how much actual substance was conveyed in the conversations per page. But in this video, I want to tackle things in a bit of a different way. See, something I love about Nisio Isin's character interactions are their specific blend of quirky and fun conversations, and dialogue that's about interesting subjects. If you've read Monogatari, you're already very familiar with his more quirky interactions, although I don't feel that Monogatari's specific brand of comedic back and forths has all that much carryover here. Much of I's interactions with Mikoko are a joy to read, I acting as this unenthused presence while Mikoko freely conveys spins the entire wheel of emotions is always an engaging dynamic. Another highlight is when Jun Aikawa teases information about hitoshiki out of E. Literally. She hugs him, starts licking his neck, and threatens him with death while simultaneously casting him sensual expressions and eventually, softly, playfully, to use the book's language, biting his neck. Needless to say, I was gonna give this book a 0 out of 10, but this scene gave me a new fetish, so it's a straight 10 on principle. It's also just fun and so goddamn aikawa. But more than that, this book's dialogue is filled to the brim with, to put it delicately, Nisio's unhinged ramblings. What I mean is that it seems like at every turn, Nisio was seeking to shift the characters' discussions towards philosophy, worldview, psychoanalysis, and views on themselves. There are an endless amount of examples of this. E says that humans don't just like or dislike people, but rather feel both towards the same person to different extents, to which he proceeds to claim that in his eyes, Mikoko likes him 70 and hates him 50. Muimi claims that most people are just living, i.e. that what they're doing with their lives is simply filling time, and that most people can die without regrets because they'll be leaving behind no important unfinished business. Mikoko shares a story about how a truck crashed into her school and spilled sand everywhere, and how to her it was this important, delightful event, but it was so unimportant to the world that it didn't even appear on the newspaper, which led to Mikoko feeling like her life was no big deal to the greater world, a sentiment she feels again when a friend of hers dies and the papers don't even dwell on it. Tomoe determines that E's an unsociable person, and opens up to him about how she has a proverbial version of herself on her shoulder looking down cynically on everything she does. E says that it's impossible to live without someone hating you, and that even something as simple as your existence can be an obstacle for someone. And we've already talked about Hitoshiki's interesting as hell motives for being a serial killer, which also includes a baked-in philosophical bent in the idea that everyone lives their lives on a track. And while this isn't dialogue, E's monologues about being a defective product are interesting for the same reason. What all these things have in common is that they give the discussions in Strangulation more importance and weight to them. These conversations are about interesting subjects. They spark the reader's imagination with interesting ways of regarding and interpreting the world, or speak to certain truths. Some of you may call it pretentious, but that's something I dearly appreciate in storytelling. And, well, like I already said, this sort of dialogue says a lot about the characters who say them. Imagine a generic isekai protagonist saying the sorts of things that Nisio's characters say in this book. Sorry, I just asked you to do the impossible. Because in saying anything remotely like this, they would cease being a generic isekai protagonist. In my opinion, this type of dialogue is one of the biggest highlights of Nisio's writing, and part of why I think he's the strongest writer I've witnessed thus far in terms of characterization and dialogue. The guy's writing is just plain thought-provoking. Perhaps that's controversial, since it implies that Zaregoto is high art, but screw you, it is. I looked up at Hitoshiki's face, blushing. I couldn't help it. This heart of mine, normally rigid and frigid, was now beating faster than it ever had before, as Hitoshiki ran his hand along my chest. Hitoshiki, I couldn't help but say. I looked up at my mirror image. He looked back. It was as if I'd become a part of the world behind the mirror. I thought such, as Hitoshiki slowly undressed me. We both knew it'd be the best day of our lives, if it weren't for Tomo Kunagisa walking in on us. What the fuck, Ichan? No, listen, I can explain. No, you cannot. I leave you two alone for 1 second. I'm being serious. There's a great explanation. And now you and that cute and boyish serial killer are at it again. Tomo, I swear, this is the last straw, Ichan. I'm so done with you. How am I supposed to humidify your life if you won't even make me wet? I apologize for spoiling such a masterpiece of a scene in full here, but it was just too good not to share. And in case you want page numbers, on the vertical release of V2, it's page 186. For those of you who want to skip this segment, Here's a time code. It doesn't actually take you to the end of the Patreon segment, it's just a random time code. Here's the actual time code to skip the Patreon segment. Written in binary, so good luck figuring it out. It doesn't even give you the time code anyway. Oh, what's that? You tried to use the YouTube video chapters to find the end of the Patreon segment? Yeah, I didn't make it its own chapter. This is technically part of Chapter 5, which means there's really no telling when it ends. Oh, and by the way, the title card for the real Chapter 5 lasts a total of 3 frames. Good luck finding it in the video scrubber. On screen right now is the combination to my high school locker. Hidden inside this locker is the time code that will take you to the end of this Patreon show. Have fun. This is Braille. And this is a screenshot from Pokemon Emerald. If you haven't gotten the message by now, you're stuck in this Patreon segment. There is no escape. You have no choice but to hear me say that giving me $5 to $10 per month, depending on the tier, is a good financial decision. Okay, real talk, I'm trying to make this my career, and every dollar helps. Plus, you can make me rant about gay sex on my second channel if you're part of the $10 tier. So, hey, I'd say that's a good deal. And with that, back to the video. If you want to go into this novel relatively unspoiled, now's your chance. In case it wasn't already clear as day, I think this novel is good. Fantastic, even. And if you've read the first volume in this series, and or watched my video about it, you know that this series has a predilection towards absolutely unhinged plot twists that hit far harder unspoiled. There's your warning. Spoilers begin in 10, 9, 0. Mikoko killed Tomoe because she opened up to Ii. Mikoko killed herself out of guilt. Muimi killed Akiharu to protect Mikoko's name. Ii was lying to the audience the entire novel and actually figured out that Mikoko killed Tomoe as soon as the police told him she died. Mikoko didn't actually kill herself out of guilt, but rather because Ii confronted her about it. Yeah, that's about par for the course in this series. So, there's a lot to unpack here. And to get to the core of it all, we must first discuss the scene of Mikoko's suicide. Ii discovers Mikoko dead in her apartment, seemingly murdered by strangulation. Of course, you and I both know it's a suicide, but at this stage of the story, it seems like a locked room murder to the reader. Ii describes feeling horribly nauseous upon seeing her body. He repeats the word gross to himself over and over again, and says he feels like he had just swallowed some absolutely indigestible object. At the police station, he outright throws up in the toilet. This is how much impact Mikoko's death has on Ii emotionally. At least, that's how it's presented, and there's no real reason to doubt this. Ii's narration says stuff like, "It was a devastating sight," and "I was used to people dying. I was even used to people close to me dying. And still, this was painful. It hurt. It hurt too much." If this reads as shockingly out of character for Ii, you had the correct reaction. Ii is apathetic and relatively numb to death. He doesn't enjoy the people around him dying for sure, but this is the first time he's been made to throw up in sheer horror at the fact that someone died. But despite feeling out of character, it's very easy to dismiss this moment as a surprising facet of his character. Ii generally feels apathetic about death, but Mikoko was a cheerful, friendly presence throughout the novel, and at this point he had been expressly told by Mikoko that she was in love with him. In fact, he was going to her apartment in order to give her an answer. He would, of course, turn her down because he's already got Tomo, but nonetheless, it's hard not to feel for someone who cares about you so much that they wish to spend the rest of their life with you. It all makes sense, and while the scene is tragic, Ii's ability to get emotional for Mikoko's death gives it just the slightest tinge of optimism. There's plenty of despair to go around in the Zaregoto series, much of it brought on by Ii's apathy. But through it all, Ii can still surprise the reader with his ability to feel genuine emotion. After the sudden death of Akiharu, the culprit becomes clear to Ii, muimi atemiya. Well, not really. Ii initially says to Hitoshiki that the culprit is obviously Muimi, and Ii does in fact confront Muimi about this, and the two proceed to have a lengthy conversation about her misdeeds. And somehow, Throughout that entire conversation, my boy Nisio keeps up the facade that Muimi committed all 3 murders. This is because E tells Muimi at the beginning of the conversation that he's pretty much figured it all out, so the two of them continue to speak under the mutual understanding that E knows what happened, which means that the conversation can conveniently leave out details like, oh, to give a small example, that Muimi only killed Akiharu. And indeed, the one and only person who E expressly says Muimi killed during this conversation is Akiharu. But later on, E explains the truth to Hitoshiki, that Muimi only killed one person. Hitoshiki is, rightfully, shocked and a little upset to hear that E just flat out lied to him at the beginning out of mere convenience. Just put a pin in this scene for now. Alright, we got another crimp board up on the wall. You know, I still have the last one. It made a cameo in my Mashal video. Mind you, I'm trying to stop this video from taking literally forever, so if I skip some things in my explanation, just don't worry about it. Throughout this novel, 3 people die: Tomoe, Mikoko, and Akiharu. Mikoko killed Tomoe, Mikoko killed herself, and Muimi killed Akiharu. Let's start with Tomoe's case. At a first glance, it seems completely impossible for Mikoko to be the culprit. E, Mikoko, Tomoe, Akiharu, and Muimi were together at Tomoe's birthday party. Akiharu and Muimi left early, covering for each other with alibis. E and Mikoko also left together, leaving Tomoe alone in her apartment. On the way back to E's apartment, Mikoko received a call on her phone from Tomoe for E, to which they have a perplexing and brief conversation. So, this call is the last confirmed time Tomoe was alive. Following this, Mikoko stayed the night at Miko's house, and we know she couldn't have escaped from there in the middle of the night undetected due to thin walls and creaky floorboards. Mikoko discovered Tomoe's body, but we know she couldn't have killed Tomoe in the morning because that time of death conflicts with the autopsy. So when the hell could Mikoko have killed Tomoe? The answer is, E and Mikoko didn't leave the apartment at the same time. E headed out of the apartment slightly early to put on his shoes, and then, in the apartment, Mikoko, on a whim, having heard E and Tomoe getting along well, decided to strangle Tomoe to death with a piece of ribbon out of jealousy. And something cool you can do here is actually go to the scene in question back when E was initially experiencing it. And you can read about E hearing a strange noise through the door as he was putting on his shoes. The murder was swift. Apparently strangulation is a quick way to go if you do it the right way. The phone call E received then wasn't actually from Tomoe. Rather, Mikoko nabbed Tomoe's phone and acted as her while walking behind E. It was an incredibly risky strategy, but it provided her with an alibi. And once again, you can go back to the initial scene and see E remark that something in her voice seemed obviously different from when he'd heard it earlier at her place. Mikoko killed herself. How do we know that? Because she left a suicide note. Duh. Hey, that was easy. Wait, a suicide note? Since when? I guess now is as good a time as any to wrestle the cat out of this here bag. E is a serial liar, and this is a running theme throughout the novel. Even during the first conversation between Mikoko and E, Mikoko supposes that E didn't go to school at the beginning of April due to some sort of delayed graduation trip, which E says is true, despite it being categorically false. Mikoko supposes in that same conversation that E's lack of personal objects in his room is a sort of ethical policy, which he also says is true, despite him actually just lacking space and not minding boredom. E tells detectives that he never forgets people's voices, when in actuality, his memory is bad enough that he can just casually forget people's existence, and he initially lies to Hitoshiki about who the killer is. If the truth is hard to explain, E won't explain it. If E has his own plans, he will lie flagrantly in order to carry them out. And this comes to a head in the answer to the novel's main mysteries, because significant portions of I's narration in Volume 2 are fabrications. He expressly lies, he lies by omission, he crafts his own narrative instead of representing a true one, and it is in I's lack of concern for conveying the truth that the nonsense of Volume 2 lies. Let's keep going. In fairness to the book, when it comes to Mikoko's suicide, even without knowing about the note, it's still a guessable cause of death. It's a locked room mystery, and the method of murder, strangulation, is also a method of suicide. The pieces were in fact there. But whoa, the Ninth Commandment is really just a suggestion on this merry day. 'Cause whoopsie, E concealed evidence that Mikoko murdered Tomoe, from the police. See, Mikoko strangled herself using the same ribbon she used on Tomoe. As well, in her suicide note, she extensively detailed her crime as well as why she committed suicide. In her note, she asked that E carry out one final request for her, to cover up her crime so as to maintain her good name. So, E ate the evidence. His nausea upon seeing Mikoko, that was just cause he ate paper and cloth. So you may be wondering, how in the hell was I supposed to be able to guess that E was covering up Mikoko's crimes? Well, this explanation is already long enough, so I won't bore you with the details, but in short, you can actually go back to this scene when it first happened and realize that the timeline of events E claims happened in his narration doesn't completely add up. It's probably not enough to guess all this, but astute readers could theoretically pick up on the fact that E's lying to them about something. And finally, we have Akiharu's death. Muimi is as yandere for Mikoko as Mikoko is for E, because she killed Akiharu to preserve Mikoko's good name, which was part of a larger scheme by Muimi to frame herself for Tomoe and Mikoko's deaths. I am too lazy to explain the evidence that supports this conclusion. And there you have it, a copiously long explanation of the ending of V2's mystery. We're all perfectly content with this version of events, and there's no further looking into it we need, and this is the Zaregoto series, you know there's more to it. Alright, Aikawa, take it away and tell me how he got everything wrong. Wait, he got everything right? You agree with his conclusion? We're only 2 novels in, and the series is already switching up the formula. So, as it turns out, unlike in the prior novel, E's detective work was solid. It's just, well, E's a filthy liar, and Aikawa has seen through his deceit. So, E told Hitoshiki that Mikoko murdered Tomoe with a piece of ribbon just lying around at her house. This would mean that Mikoko's murder was spur of the moment. However, E had access to a police report listing all the items present at Tomoe's apartment, and E observed only a single item missing from her house that he remembered, and it was not the ribbon. The ribbon was still there, which means she couldn't have brought it back to her apartment and committed suicide with it, despite it being established that she strangled herself with the same weapon she used to kill Tomoe. Mikoko brought a weapon with her to Tomoe's party. It was a premeditated murder. And with that, the nonsense can truly begin. Mikoko saw that E and Tomoe had similar vibes to them, and suspected that they'd get along. So, she faked sleep in order to get a taste for what their conversational dynamic was like. Tomoe ended up revealing a lot about herself to E, and got very personal with him very quickly. So, she killed her. In E's earlier explanation, he implies that he only figured out that Mikoko murdered Tomoe upon reading her suicide note. This is a lie. E suspected that Mikoko murdered Tomoe as soon as he heard that Tomoe died. He wasn't 100% sure, but he had an inkling in his mind. This crime of passion infuriated E, so he confronted Mikoko about it. And the thing is, this confrontation isn't obscured in the book. We get to see E tell Mikoko off for murdering Tomoe as it happens chronologically, but it's a veiled challenge. E doesn't directly accuse Mikoko of anything. He simply states that he detests murderers and says that he wants to ask the person who killed Tomoe if they can justify their own existence. Getting into specifics would drag this section out to an even more unbelievable extent than it has already, but this conversation right here where E challenges Mikoko is one of the highlights of the novel, specifically on reread. On a first pass, it's good, don't get me wrong. But knowing E's specific intentions with what he's saying makes it outright tense, and parts of it make a lot more sense knowing the context. Like how when asked what Tomoe's influence on her was, Mikoko responds with a sentiment that implies that she cares about E much more than Tomoe, which is certainly a strange response. Anyway, E only ever intended for Mikoko to turn herself in. But having her crush ask if she can justify her own existence caused her to kill herself, which shocked E to the point where he's unsure whether his nausea was entirely caused by swallowing inedible objects or if it was due to the shock of the situation. But pressingly, it wasn't because of how much he cared about Mikoko. He detested her actions, and well, we'll get to a certain other line of dialogue in a bit. During his prior explanation to Hitoshiki, E also omitted information about why he told Muimi that X over Y was a dying message. He lied about what Mikoko's suicide note contained, he lied throughout the novel by pretending he didn't realize Mikoko was in love with him. The dude just cannot tell a story without lying. For the record, Mikoko's suicide note was a single sentence long, and Mikoko never asked him to cover up her murder. Hoo boy. So, just like Volume 1, for me, the ending was a tough pill to swallow at first. The question that came to my mind was, how do we trust E to say anything truthful ever again, when it's now part of the plot that he can just lie about everything? It's almost like when a good friend of yours betrays your trust, or something. I mean, hey, I like E, but after sitting on it for a bit, I really like this ending. And the reason why is because it's an entirely different brand of nonsense than the conclusion to V1's mystery. In V1, the nonsense came in the form of the mystery's true resolution being convoluted beyond belief, with Konami playing 5D chess to steal Akane's identity. V2's mystery is a lot less bombastic and admittedly a lot less fun to explain. But it's different from Volume 1 while skirting just as close to shattering all sense of suspension of disbelief, while somehow making a bizarre sort of sense. In V1, E could hardly be called an unreliable narrator at all, whereas V2 revels in mistruths to create a brand new, equally mind-bending conclusion. It's fabulous, although to be fair, I can't say I'm hoping for another volume that relies on E's unreliable narration to this extent anytime soon. Although if a future volume were to utilize this aspect of E's character heavily, I imagine it'd be for a good reason. Hopefully. But we're not quite done here. The mystery is cool and all, but what about emotions and all that shit? V1's ending heckin the feels and stuff, with E nearly giving up his life of his own free will, in this powerful and riveting scene that has never left my head in the time since I read it. What does V2 do to rival this? Well, it's more subtle this time around, and your mileage may vary, but for me, the emotional crux of the story's conclusion is a small moment on page 295, where Hitoshiki asks E the following question. You had people killing friends, killing themselves, killing for their friends, being killed for friends, and as a bonus, you almost got killed. How do you feel about all that? Zerozaki, here's how I feel about this string of cases. Okay, let's have it. I talked a little too much this time. My throat hurts almost as much as my fingers. Zerozaki froze. His face twitched for an instant, before he exploded into laughter. I'll bet it does. In other words, you don't care if your friends die. No, even a guy like me undergoes some shock at the death of a friend. It's just that I hadn't become friends with these people yet. In terms of his lies to the audience, E's cruelest was pretending he cared for Mikoko enough that he truly felt horrible that she died. And maybe his nausea was in part due to the surprise of her suicide, but he was not emotionally devastated. He didn't care that Mikoko cared for him, and he did not consider her a friend. Aikawa later asks E, Say, you really didn't care either way, did you? It could be in reference to dozens of things, but what specifically she was referring to doesn't really matter, because the only answer that fit was, nah, he didn't care whatsoever. The real tragedy of I's character is that even when it looks like he's showing a new hidden side of himself that cares about people more than he'd like to admit, it's all wrested away at the last minute, as I misleads the audience into misreading his character. And it's here that I'd like to draw a comparison to V1's ending. V1's ending is what I would consider, at least, to be hopeful. I'm cold that way. No, that's not right. I'm probably dry that way, apathetic and indifferent, and that's why, for me, kunagisa is so humidifying. I is the happiest when he's by Kunagisa's side. He has fun by her side, or at the very least, the closest thing to fun I can experience. He cares for her enough that if Tomo were murdered, he reckons he'd break down screaming. And so, there's proof I is not just apathetic. He's not just suicidal. Tomo is someone he can ground himself to, who can help him wade through the darkness. And the resolution to I's arc in this book is choosing to date Kunagisa, thereby keeping himself more tethered to her, and by extension, the world. But Tomo is absent for much of V2. He doesn't have that humidifying presence in his life for the majority of V2's pages. At the end of the novel, instead of talking about how much of a positive influence Tomo has on his life, he talks about how someday he'll want to smash that girl, just like he did 5 years ago. And by smash, he absolutely does not mean the kind he does to hitoshiki every night. He's talking about his violent urges taking over. His previous emotional outburst proven to be in large part a fabrication, his apathy seemingly reinforced with concrete. Just as suicidal now as he ever was, having to deal with his violent urges, Volume 2 leaves us to stew on the tragedy of I. So you may be wondering, what does X over Y mean? Well, in the novel, Tomo says you're supposed to look at it in a mirror and rotate it. So, here you go. Do you see it? No? What are you, stupid? How do you not see it? I mean, it's so obvious. It's 420, which is Mikoko's birthday. Yeah, I cannot for the life of me wrap my head around how Tomo figured all this out in 5 seconds. Having now read 2 Zaregoto novels, I can now begin a new tradition for this series, the Zaregoto novels tier list. So here we have V1. We're going to put it in the Zaregoto tier, which is roughly a 9 out of 10. Alright, but here's the moment we've all been waiting for. V2 is commonly seen as a clean improvement over V1. So if V1 is all the way up there, I mean, V2 has to be in the I wanna sex Nisio tier, right? Okay? So they might be in the same tier, but V2 must be like, you know, higher within the same tier, right? Like V1's on the low end and V2's on the high end, right? Let's put a pin in that for now, and for a wee little bit talk about where I initially put V2 as soon as I finished it. When I first finished V2, I was of the, more than unpopular opinion that V1 was better. But ever since finishing the novel, the more I thought about it, and got bullied for my opinion, I not only raised it a tier, but also stopped being so sure it wasn't as good as V1. But the thing is, this is the same thing that happened to me when I first finished V1. I gave it an 8, only to raise it to a 9. I then gave V2 an 8, only to raise it to a 9. Which leads me to this conclusion. V1 and V2 are way closer in quality than people give it credit for. And the thing is, it's not like either volume has much wrong with it. Each novel does what they try to do exceptionally well. It really comes down to what each book does right, and the extent of how right they do each thing. But let's start with a controversial opinion. Volume 1 has the single most emotional scene out of either novel, and I've gotten so much flack for this opinion, but I am dying on this hill. The scene where E confronts Akane is genuinely my favorite scene in the series thus far. It's so emotionally arresting and downright beautiful in a way. I cannot get over how great it is. Although E has been apathetic throughout the story, it's only at this moment that we realize just how unattached to the world he is, when he willingly gives up his life. V2 doesn't really have anything quite as impactful. Mikoko's suicide is the closest it gets, and it's certainly the most impactful death of the series so far. But it didn't quite get me the same way that the aforementioned moment in V1 did. That moment in V1 was the culmination of an entire book's worth of characterization for E, and was executed in the absolute best and most riveting way possible, ending in a small bit of character growth. He made the decision to keep living despite him not really caring if he dies, and decided to ground himself in the world by dating Tomo. Or at least, I interpreted it as E grounding himself in the world, but some grounding it was considering E's just as suicidal as ever in V2. Mikoko's death scene gets better on reread when you know precisely why she died, but to me, it doesn't beat out Volume 1's most emotional scene. And while V2's pessimism near the end is haunting, it's actually the sort of thing that I reckon will get more emotionally powerful in future volumes, when we're faced with the prospect of E making progress and overcoming these flaws. One of the major reasons why people tend to prefer V2, at least to my understanding based on the conversations I've had with people in my Discord server, is that E's character gets much better in that volume. There's certainly more to him than in V1. We get more backstory and flesh out his darker sides a bit. I've heard that people really started to connect with E in V2, because they felt similarly about their own lives at the time. And I can definitely see that way to relate to E. Like I said, his despair is more palpable than ever in this volume. But to me, while his despair is fascinating, the stuff V1 does with him is also fascinating. In V1, E starts off as something of an enigma, with Maki Himena slowly helping to reveal E's flaws to the audience. It was a really interesting thing to witness, and like I've beaten to your heads so damn much, the scene with Akane is the pinnacle of what V1 does with his character. I appreciate what V2 does for E's character a lot. It fleshes him out more, which is what a sequel ought to do. In that regard, V2 passes with flying colors. I'm just not sure I'd say it's so much better than what V1 did so as to be obviously superior. V2 loses some points for not including Tomo. Tomo and E's dynamic was one of my favorite parts of V1 by far, and its absence in V2 was missed by me. I'd be remiss to call her general absence a flaw with the book, but it's something I desperately wanted more of. But then V2 has hitoshiki, and hitoshiki and E's, very sexually charged, dynamic is fascinating. And having hitoshiki is definitely way better than not having hitoshiki. V2 also has Mikoko, and hey, I like Mikoko. At first, I thought I slightly preferred V1's mystery to V2's. The scenes with classic detective work and discussing theories as to who the killer was were all super entertaining, and Konami's plan was so deliberately out there and absurd, and the book played it so straight, that it's an ending that will never leave my brain. I had so much fun explaining it to y'all in the previous Zaregoto video. But the thing is, E's incessant lying gives V2's story such a unique appeal to it that I only appreciate more and more as time goes on, even if it's admittedly less fun to explain. V2 also has more of Nisio's ramblings, which is something I praised in V1 and got more of in V2. And oh my lord, am I glad to have more of them, because it makes V2's dialogue an experience. V2's side characters are generally better developed than V1's due to there being straight up less of them. Aikawa gets more scenes, and her role as the strongest character is fleshed out. Muimi and tomoe both get a fair bit of development, and although Akiharu and Miiko don't get as much time in the spotlight, they're not far behind any V1 side characters. Despite her general lack of presence, I actually find Miiko to be the most immediately endearing side character introduced in this volume. She's just E's chill yet eccentric neighbor. I love her. But despite V1 containing far more characters, and indeed having some stragglers who get pretty much no development, I strangely feel more endeared to Maki, Akane, Kanami, and Iria than most of V2's supporting cast. See, in Volume 1, many of the side characters were geniuses, and were immediately interesting due to their specific skill sets. You wanted to see what made them geniuses, and the answer to that question was always interesting. I also just love Akane to bits. Well, Kanami LARPing as Akane, anyway. I also just vibe with all their personalities more, similar to how I feel about Miiko from V2. They're all so distinctly quirky and memorable, not to mention that all the characters simultaneously exist as set pieces for the fascinating locale known as Wet Crow's Feather Island, an island that houses geniuses, so even the stragglers don't feel completely superfluous since they breathe more life into the setting. It took reading V2 for me to realize just how much the setting of V1 added to my enjoyment of it. Wet Crow's Feather Island is just interesting to be in. It's got this cool mansion with all these wacky characters who all have unique skill sets. This is an appeal that V2 just doesn't have, nor does it even try to have it. Although even given what I just said, I will admit that V2 having more aikawa in it than V1 is so based that I almost want to give it the dub on principle, and I do appreciate that V2's characters are overall better constructed. Also, yeah, I really like Miiko. If V3 contains more of her, I will be leaping with joy. So, which is better, V1 or V2? The answer is, I don't know. Okay, listen, the real answer is I've been going back and forth on which I think is better since I finished it. Sometimes I think of V1's absurdly entertaining mystery and say it's better. Sometimes I think of V2 having hitoshiki in it and say it's better. If I had to pick one right now as I'm writing this, I'd probably say it's V1, because it's the sort of novel I just love sitting in and existing on this island of cool-ass geniuses. But 3 goddamn days ago, I would have told you it was V2 because of its dialogue. Hello to the me that's editing this video. You changed your mind again, didn't you? I know in this section I've mostly been talking down V2 from the position of being clearly superior to V1, but I seriously can't bring myself to say with much certainty that V1 is better. So you know what? I'm gonna piss each and every one of you watching off to high life and low death and say that they're even Steven. Or more so that I'll probably figure it out further along in this here video series on Zaregoto. But really, the point of this section isn't whether or not V2 is better than V1. That's something I myself am still undecided on. My point is, they're close. Way closer in quality than everyone else says they are. And I hope I've at least justified to you why I feel that way. Why can't you write a novel in 3 days? I'm sure most people would like to be able to write a novel in 3 days. Hell, most people would like to write a novel in the first place. Of course, I'm speaking from the experience of having written one before. I wouldn't like to write a novel, I already have. I'd like to write more of them. And to that end, I would like to be able to write one in 3 days. For some, the barrier that gets them might be the raw typing speed required, although I think most people under the age of 60 can theoretically press the keys fast enough to do it. Although even more pressing than what you're physically able to type is how consistently you can come up with a sufficient amount of ideas quickly enough to keep your fingers moving at all costs. Every moment spent thinking about what to write instead of actually writing is a moment you've slowed down, and you can't really afford to do that now, can you? For some, it might be the exhaustion of writing day in and day out. Writing is, after all, rather strenuous mental labor. And hell, surely your hands would get tired after a certain point, so you could argue there's a physical challenge too. For some, it might be a problem with their schedule. For others, a problem with creativity. For others, it just doesn't seem like fun, and the downsides outweigh the upsides. Perhaps it's a combination of every single thing I've mentioned so far. But for me, my biggest hurdle is the idea of putting something so raw, so spur of the moment, something that I had so little time to think about or polish to the world. Sure, writers have editors who clean up grammar mistakes and make the book fit for publication, so it's not like Nisio's unedited manuscript was published. I imagine there was a cleanup process after finishing the novel. It's quite possible that having an editor gave Nisio some peace of mind in being able to write a novel this quickly and seemingly just be done with it after 3 days. And I don't have an editor, so you just have to live with my mediocre grammar that constantly switches between British English and American English depending on which spelling I think looks better. And maybe Nisio did revisit the novel briefly before publication, and found little to nothing to change in the first place despite its short development. But as someone who is writing this paragraph having already rendered significant portions of this video, and whose workflow intentionally allows me to go back and edit significant portions of my script as close to the deadline as the day before a video goes up, I most certainly cannot relate to this. The rough draft of this video was written rather quickly for my standards. I spent about 5 days writing some 11,000 words. But there is no way in hell that you're getting that version of the video. By the time you hear these words, I will have heard them 6 times over. Each time I read them over, they mutate, permutate, warp, distort, becoming a little sharper, a little more poignant, a little better, and a little more distant from my imperfections. There's nothing dishonorable about this process. Monetarily, there's a lot to be gained from shortening my production cycle. But artistically, I gain nothing by shortening this process. To what end would I do so? To intentionally put out a rougher product? It's silly, and yet I envy any artist who can do so. Why? If you were to show me someone who is never wrong, you'd have somehow shown me God. In reality, people are only experts on a very narrow spectrum of topics, if that. A truck driver is an expert on truck driving. An office worker is an expert on office working. A scientist is an expert in their particular field. And yet even then, the truth, the full truth, and nothing but the truth is likely a hotly contested issue. After all, for every positive claim, its inverse exists. Much of the time, the longer you spend chipping away at a subject trying to locate its core, the further said core seems, as you get closer to the core only to discover contradictions upon contradictions. This video itself may very well have contradictions, and for every sentence I've said today, there's surely someone out there who disagrees with it. How can I stand here and speak loudly enough to drown out every dissenting voice as if there isn't a chance they're right? The way I see it, holding an opinion is like standing right next to a precarious cliff, as 1,000 other voices manifest as hurricane-force winds trying to knock you down. But let's get needlessly abstract for a second. We humans often think only of our own perspective on the world, and yet our capacity to perceive the world is inherently limited. The human eye can process 3 color channels: red, blue, and green. A mantis shrimp can process 12. Do we ever think about how mantis shrimps perceive the world? Who's to say that a human perspective on the world is even the correct one? Is any perspective truly correct? Who's to say that there aren't a billion concepts just outside our ability to understand that, if any one were to be brought to our attention, our understanding of the world would be entirely upended? Who's to say solipsism isn't right and everyone watching this is just a figment of my imagination? Asking such abstract questions serves no purpose other than a rhetorical one. At the end of the day, worrying about the answers to questions you can't solve is about as insane as it gets. But I ask myself these questions because they're tied to this point. Being right is no easy feat, and being wrong is terrifying to me. And sure, if you have enough opinions, you'll end up being right about a few of them, broken clock and all that. But what I'm talking about here is doing the research, considering every side, and coming to a conclusion about it. It's too time-consuming to bother with, foremost and most of the time. But what if you are driven to find the truth? In most cases, whenever you form opinions about a subject, there is a monumental gap in knowledge between you and the experts of said subject, and those experts probably fervently disagree with each other, making it even harder for a bystander to make sense of the truth. And even if you do find the truth, you have to contend with the chance that something new will be discovered, completely disproving your beliefs and making you realize that you'd been supporting the wrong side all along. And you always gotta be careful about logical fallacies and the fundamental drive to conform. And remember, kids, you don't know what you don't know. To be right about everything is to be God. To be wrong about everything is just plain human. And here I am, bothered by the possibility that everything I say rings true while not being true. There are times when I write something, and then there'll be a certain plot point, or if it's a YouTube video, a point I make in my video that I just keep going over in my head. Over and over, over and over, endlessly. Like, I believe in the point, but I can't trust it. There's some subtle, nearly intangible feeling that there's something I'm not getting, that I said something I can't entirely prove, that there's some mysterious property to it that hasn't clicked in my brain yet. It's uncertainty, and to say anything at all, you must embrace it. Speculation is a necessity, and proof is never airtight. But it's something I have trouble embracing. Uncertainty is not a friend, but a specter that haunts me every time I think about my writing. I want nothing more than to have finished growing, to never change because I don't need to change, to have already discovered the truths of the world, and for there to be nothing left to find. To never ever 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 have to issue a correction on a stupid anime video, where misinterpreting a scene categorically harms no one, and where all that happens to you upon being wrong is that you look silly for a few days, and then everyone forgets about it. It seems you don't fear change, but in fact enjoy it. Looking back 15 years, did you feel you had changed? Yes. Like, seeing the occasional bit of writing from back then, it's completely wrong. There were times when I was doing this intentionally, and other times when I was not. So it reminded me of when I was writing back then. Just this time, looking back, I once again felt that I can't deny what I had written in the past. Even if I think I have a different opinion now, or I wouldn't have accepted this style of writing. This is very much only my present opinion. Rather, I should enjoy the fact that I was able to write both. This is an excerpt from my favorite Nisio Isin interview. Unfortunately, the original WordPress website that translated the interview got deleted, but archives exist. And of my favorite Nisio Isin interview, this is perhaps my favorite paragraph, because in so few words it describes the type of writer I wish I was and want to be. Of course, I don't actually know Nisio's thoughts and feelings, so I don't know how little of a perfectionist he really is. But this quote tracks with writing a book in 3 days, and it tracks with rarely even planning out your stories beforehand, or spending 1 day polishing them. Writing a novel in 3 days isn't particularly admirable. It's impressive, for sure, but nobody will begrudge you for not doing it. And I think most people would argue that taking your time with it will produce a better product anyway. But the reason why this feat has stuck with me so much as something I want to replicate is because it flies in the face of everything about my artistic method. It at least paints the picture of someone who is able to let go. The reason why I can't write a novel in 3 days, well, okay, I'd probably do it in more like a week because 3 days sounds pretty tiring. Plus, I don't have an editor. The reason why I can't write a novel in a week is because I probably can, and I can do it poorly. I want the safety net of being able to think things through just a little more, of reading it over one more time, of ridding it of every last plot hole and logical inconsistency. It's all just perfectionism, innit? If your goal is to always be right about everything, you might as well stitch your mouth shut and never hold a pen again. Maybe someday I'll learn to trust myself enough to write a novel in a week, to give up overthinking every small detail and learn to trust my heuristic analysis and gut feelings. It really does seem like a fun challenge. I just hate how my mindset sabotages me and makes it seem so much more daunting and painful than it should be. And hey, I make my seasonal videos in anywhere from 5 to 6 days, so clearly I can make some things quickly. Life is a difficult thing to wrap your head around. Will you be on the right side of history? The wrong? What about the indecisive centrist route? Or maybe you can just be apathetic about truth a la E. The reality is, I'll be dead right about some things and so wrong about the others I'll wish I was dead. But whatever mistakes I make along the way, I hope I can love them. You know, I'd love to just leave you on that emotionally resonant / desperately cringe ending to this video, but we have some peoples to shout out. First of all, Rainjo, who made the thumbnail for this video. It looks amazing, and he captured the feeling I wanted it to convey far better than my Photoshop skills can. And now, patrons. Alvilan, CJ, Ijo Saigai, Izzy, Jose Ramirez, Karen Chan, KD Pack, Minnie, Neon Manta, Sophia, Ultra Seraph, Bidufus, Dr. Awu, and Loganos. Thank you for your patronage.